So, here it is, the story Buckingham Palace finally confirmed tonight, the one half of London has been whispering about for weeks. King Charles is stepping back from public life, and the center of gravity inside the palace is moving toward Prince William and Catherine. But that is not the part that has got everyone talking. The real story is a single handwritten line buried in the final pages of the transition order, a line that locks Camilla out of the monarchy's decision-making completely. And from what we are hearing, she did not see it coming until the document had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. If you have been following the royal family, you know how carefully Charles has been managing his public image for months. We saw the staged photographs of him working at his desk. We heard the statements insisting he was still going through his red boxes. We were told over and over that the cancer treatment was not slowing him down. But behind the scenes, the reality looked very different. Meetings were quietly cancelled. Ceremonies were shortened. And Prince William was silently absorbing more and more of the king's public schedule. What we are learning now is that the breaking point came during a rehearsal for a state ceremony in London. Charles arrived determined to get through it, but witnesses say his body simply would not cooperate. The color left his face. His replies grew shorter. His focus kept slipping. Eventually the room had to be cleared and his doctors were called in. Their message was blunt. If he kept pushing himself, he would undo every piece of progress he had made. He needed to hand over most of his responsibilities immediately and prepare for an absence far longer than anyone had publicly admitted. That led to an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small circle of constitutional advisors were summoned without explanation. Before we get into what happened inside that room, I have to ask you something. Are you happy that Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you think Camilla has held on to palace influence for far too long, do not just sit there and watch this story in silence. Like this video and subscribe to our channel, so you do not miss what happens next, because this is far from over. So they are all seated around the table and there is a sealed folder in the middle of it. The title on the cover reads The Crown Powers Transfer Order. At first William assumes it is about rescheduling a few cancelled engagements. Catherine thinks it is a temporary arrangement. Then Charles opens the document and explains what it actually does. It transfers state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term direction of the monarchy directly to William. And then he turns to Catherine. Under this order she would take on responsibilities normally expected of the reigning queen. State banquets. Diplomatic receptions. The royal household's public program. Essentially all the visible duties that tell Britain and the Commonwealth who now stands at the center of royal life. Now Catherine did not respond right away, and honestly I get it. Accepting a role like that changes how every single future appearance will be interpreted. It is one thing to support your husband. It is another thing to step into a position that makes you look like you are already the queen and simply waiting. William pushed back as well. He told Charles that people would look at this and think the transition had been forced, that it would come across as ambition rather than necessity. But Charles was clear. He said the decision was his and his alone, and that protecting the monarchy could not mean pretending his strength had not changed. He was trying to shield them from the blame. But here is where it gets strange. Before the meeting could continue, Princess Anne placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of Camilla's household. These were not ordinary emails. They were plans. Plans for how Camilla could protect her authority if Charles stepped away. How her office could keep influence over ceremonies, appointments, and the palace program. How William's control could be described as temporary even if Charles remained absent for months. William read the first page twice. Catherine stayed completely still. The implications were impossible to ignore. While Charles was struggling to hold his duties together, Camilla's household had already been discussing how to keep power in her hands, and neither William nor Catherine had been invited into those conversations. Charles had not approved them, and had discovered them before the plan could go any further. The language in those notes was careful. Nothing sounded openly rebellious. Nobody used the word power. But every single line pointed in the same direction. Camilla's office had been preparing for Charles's absence before William was even told how serious that absence might become. The proposal described an advisory council based at Clarence House. It would allow Camilla's office to review ceremonial plans, recommend changes to the royal diary, and remain involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph even suggested that William's expanded authority should be described as temporary, regardless of how long Charles stayed away. That sentence changed the entire room. William asked who had written it and turned to another page, pointing at a list of names. Senior members of Camilla's office. Private secretaries. Household advisors. Charles read the names in silence. He had not approved the meeting. He had not requested the proposal. And he had definitely not been told that his wife's household was already discussing how to preserve its influence after he stepped back. Catherine's attention moved to the margins of the document. There were handwritten comments beside the proposals. One recommended that major ceremonial decisions should require consultation with the Queen's office. Another warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the only center of authority while the king recovered. The message underneath all that polite wording was unmistakable. William could carry the burden, but Camilla intended to keep a hand on the controls. And explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide became uneasy. The concern was framed as continuity, stability, experience. Palace language can make almost anything sound harmless. But Charles closed the folder and asked the question everyone was thinking. Did Camilla know about this? And said the discussions had taken place through her household, but the documents did not show how much she had personally approved. William looked toward the door, ready to confront her right there. Charles stopped him. He said this could not become a corridor confrontation, not with staff moving through the palace and reporters watching every change in the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned privately and given a chance to explain. The meeting broke for 20 minutes. William walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His anger had not gone away. It had settled into something colder. Catherine followed him and reminded him that the papers were dangerous precisely because they looked reasonable. A public accusation would allow Camilla's office to deny everything and paint William as a man desperate for the crown. He understood that this made it worse. When Camilla finally entered the room, Charles was seated at the head of the table with the folder still closed. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat directly opposite the chair prepared for Camilla. Nobody raised their voice. The silence did enough. Charles asked her directly whether her household had discussed an advisory council operating from Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla paused, then said that responsible staff had considered several possibilities. She described it as preparation, not ambition. She argued that a monarchy facing uncertainty could not afford to discard experience. She had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, the personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision would not create stability. It would create disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. She proposed a formal position that would allow her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the public program. William would manage the constitutional business. Catherine could represent the crown beside him. But Camilla's household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were concerned. It sounded like compromise. It was not. Catherine asked one question. Who would make the final decision when William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla answered that Charles's wishes should guide them. But that was the problem. Charles's absence was the entire reason this arrangement existed. Yet Camilla's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would come back through phone calls, competing instructions, and appeals for intervention. And opened the folder and slid one page toward Charles. It described William's authority as reversible. That word ended the discussion. Charles told Camilla that no amendment would be made that created a second court or weakened the heir's authority. Camilla's expression changed. She turned to William and asked if this was what he wanted. William answered that he had not written the order. Charles had. For a long moment Camilla did not move. Her eyes glistened once, then hardened, and she left without accepting the decision. The door closed softly behind her, but nobody mistook calm for surrender. Charles then asked the constitutional advisor the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor looked at the final page and said there was one way to make sure they never could. He explained that a transfer of duties could be challenged through interpretation. A household might claim consultation rights. An aide might delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those moves would overturn William's authority, but each one could slow it, weaken it, and drag the king back into the very struggle he was trying to escape. Charles understood that this was no longer about whether William could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct him while pretending to protect the crown. William moved away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. He told Charles that he would not accept authority built on public humiliation. He would not appear before the country as though illness had become an opportunity. If the announcement went ahead, it had to preserve the king's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside was not surrender. He said it was a choice made before weakness allowed others to choose for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented. Her concern was clarity. The country could not be shown one arrangement while the palace operated under another. If William was expected to lead, the public program had to reflect it. If Catherine was expected to assume the Queen's visible duties, no private office could quietly revise her decisions. And watched Charles closely. He had spent years balancing affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every compromise led back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing beside him. William needed unquestioned authority as heir. Catherine needed protection from accusations that she had taken something that was not hers. The monarchy needed one voice. Only one of those needs could govern the order. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were removed. State audiences would pass directly to William. Senior palace appointments would require his approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the royal household. And would remain the bridge. Not the ruler. Not the rival. The witness. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than anyone expected. The answers became less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement could not remain temporary forever simply because no one wished to name what came next. The crown could not live inside a pause. Charles reached the final page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected him to sign. Catherine expected another delay. And noticed his hand move away from the signature and toward the blank space below the last clause. He began to write slowly. No authority transferred under this order may be reviewed, revised, or challenged by the household of the Queen. That one sentence changed everything. William read it once, then again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It was a barrier. Charles had not merely transferred responsibility to his son. He had blocked the office most likely to contest how that responsibility would be used. Catherine looked toward Anne. And gave no sign of surprise, but her stillness revealed that she understood the scale of what had just happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. That mattered. Typewritten language could be blamed on advisors. Legal phrasing could be described as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king could not be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Charles signed beneath the sentence and added his witness mark. William placed his hand on the document but did not pick it up. For a few seconds father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, aware that the paper between them had changed more than the royal diary. It had changed the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation. Clarence House. Camilla received it before the announcement was even drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Her eyes filled, and then she blinked it back and called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace had ended. The fight over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff expected anger. What they saw instead was control. She placed the copied order on the table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct. They left no space for negotiation, no quiet route back into palace decisions, and no chance to claim that William's authority remained dependent on her approval. Camilla asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor answered carefully. The king had written it himself. The seal had been applied. And had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla understood the problem. Charles had closed the door before she could reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she appear beside him anyway. A united image might preserve the influence the document had removed. Camilla rejected the idea. Standing beneath the palace cameras while William and Catherine were presented as the new center of the monarchy would look like consent. Worse, it would make her a witness to her own exclusion. She would not give them that picture. Across London, Buckingham Palace moved with unusual speed. Communications officers drafted the statement. Ceremonial staff measured positions in the throne room. Security teams revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the country regarding the future conduct of royal duties. The language was chosen with care. Charles was not abdicating. William was not being crowned. Catherine was not being declared queen. Yet every practical detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible weight of the crown was moving with it. The palace statement would call it continuity. The room would call it succession. Charles insisted on appearing first. Advisors wanted a written announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak for him. He would look into the cameras, explain the decision, and make clear that William had not demanded it. That mattered to him more than anyone realized. William had spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was not desire. Charles knew how quickly the public could turn duty into ambition. One photograph of William near the throne, one poorly chosen phrase, one suggestion that Catherine looked too comfortable, and the transition could be recast as a family takeover. So Charles would carry the blame. He approved a short address stating that his recovery required a reduction in duties. He would confirm that William was assuming responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would name Catherine as the person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then he added a line the advisors had not prepared. The future cannot wait for pride to finish conceding what duty has already decided. No one asked him to remove it. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place remained available near Charles during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. The distinction cut deeper than any public insult. Camilla sent one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked whether Charles would reconsider the restriction on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood as signed. Camilla cancelled her car. Outside Buckingham Palace, broadcasters began live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by then William and Catherine. Camilla was missing. Rumors spread immediately. Some claimed illness. Others suggested a private disagreement. Palace officials repeated the same phrase. A private family matter. Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order beside him. William arrived first. Catherine followed. And stood by the window watching the courtyard below fill with cameras. Charles looked tired, but his voice remained steady. He told William that the announcement would change the public understanding of their relationship. From that moment, every decision would be examined for signs of conflict. Every absence would become a theory. Every appearance would be treated as a declaration. William answered that he would honor the reign already in progress. Catherine said nothing. She was looking at the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One bore William's place. The other bore hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed that Camilla would not attend. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live, the palace doors opened, and before Charles spoke a single word, Britain saw who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to stay away. Charles entered the prepared room alone. For several seconds he stood behind the lectern without speaking. The cameras had found the strain around his eyes. No palace statement could hide it. He looked determined, but the effort required to remain there was visible. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes demands a person recognize the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily weight of the crown. And the institution required leadership that could act without hesitation. He named William. The words were measured, but their meaning traveled through London, Westminster, and every newsroom in the country. Following the address, William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-range direction of the royal household. The arrangement would begin immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. Her role would not be decorative. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public burden. The room remained silent. Charles did not mention Camilla. That omission struck harder than any criticism could have done. He thanked those who had supported him during his treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, and the future. But the woman who had stood beside him through his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of authority. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the address with two staff members. She did not speak when William's name was announced. She did not move when Catherine's new responsibilities were listed. Only when Charles finished without naming any continuing role for her did her composure finally crack. A single tear escaped before she turned her face away. Then she reached for the copy of the order again. The handwritten sentence waited near the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The moment was carefully controlled. The emotion was not. Charles placed one hand on William's arm, then released it quickly, as though holding on any longer might reveal too much. Catherine joined them a few steps later. She wore no crown, no tiara, and no symbol suggesting celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more than any speech. And watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments presented as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no feeling of victory. Only a family trying to turn a private collapse of confidence into a public image of order. Then Charles left. The cameras remained. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where the two ceremonial chairs had been positioned beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together, slowly enough for every broadcaster to capture the image. The symbolism was immediate. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that could not easily be reversed. William stopped before the first chair. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat at once. For one suspended moment they remained standing, aware that the country was watching them inherit responsibility before it inherited a new monarch. Then William took his place. Catherine followed. The pictures spread across television screens and phones within minutes. Commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described it as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer could be when the ceremony had been designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's next center. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials repeated that her absence concerned a private family matter. The phrase satisfied no one. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already learned that her car had been cancelled before the address. Others discovered that no future ceremonial role for her appeared in the public briefing. The explanation began to unravel inside Clarence House. Camilla ordered the television switched off. She had expected Charles to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible in front of the world. She had certainly not expected Catherine to assume duties Camilla believed should remain attached to her position. Her title had not been removed. Her influence had. After the cameras left, a private secretary handed William the signed order rather than the public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge William would have to pass that sentence before reaching the king's signature. It had not been an afterthought. It was the whole point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside the building felt emptied of ceremony. Charles was waiting near the window. Catherine stood beside a table covered with briefing papers. And remained by the door holding the second sealed folder no one had yet discussed. William placed the order before his father. He asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles did not answer at once. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the one line that had transformed a medical arrangement into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left unsaid. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload. Camilla's private preparations had forced him to decide where authority ended. Without that sentence, every decision could have become a negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned at Clarence House. A state banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles intervened. The king would have stepped away in public while continuing to settle disputes in private. That was not recovery. That was another form of captivity. Charles told William that he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time there could be no blurred line, no rival office, no second court operating through friendship, access, or habit. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to change. His father had not written the restriction to embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he knew how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost more quietly. Charles had protected their authority, but in doing so he had exposed the fracture inside his own household. The public would see a careful transition. The family would remember the argument behind it. And finally moved from the door. She said the sentence would be studied for years because it revealed the moment Charles stopped trying to satisfy everyone. As king, he had chosen one line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequence. At Clarence House, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained. Her staff remained. Her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained. Yet the machinery that gave those things influence had shifted away from her. Decisions would now leave William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer reopen what had been settled. Camilla had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most. The power to shape what came next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia had traveled across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics called it a soft transfer. Palace officials refused both descriptions. They repeated that Charles remained king and that the arrangement protected continuity. But symbols speak when statements refuse to. 2 chairs had been prepared. 2 names had been announced. 1 household had been excluded. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition must not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation. No deliberate humiliation. No attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed. But the promise carried a limit. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. Catherine supported that line. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be permitted to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement. Firm. Clear. Final. And placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait. And said it could not. The cover carried a short title. The Queen's Household, Privileges, Residences, and Access. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using while Charles remained away from public life. One page concerned Clarence House. Another concerned Buckingham Palace. But the final page carried a handwritten note beside Camilla's name. It identified the exact date her unrestricted palace access could end. And it had been approved before the throne room announcement began. Camilla had not seen it. William had not seen it. And when it opened that final page, even Charles appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. That document, and the single residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first, is where the next chapter begins.